In 2020, the United States Air Force and Space Force sponsored a Capture the Flag-style hacking competition designed to inspire the world's top cybersecurity talent to develop the skills necessary to help reduce vulnerabilities and build more secure space systems. The top 8 teams from our qualification round worked through a series of final event challenges. The teams vied for the chance to send their code to instruct an on-orbit satellite to take a picture of the moon. In 2021, Hackasat 2 featured a 24-hour attack-defend-style CTF with physical hardware called a FlatSat. Each team also had access to a digital twin where they could try out their commands in a simulated space environment. Once again, our final event has drawn the best hacking teams in the world to work through an attack and defend CTF. This time, the entire game takes place within digital twin technology, which provides the most realistic space environment yet. The simulation is designed to prepare teams for Hackasat 4, when the entire game will be hosted on an on-orbit satellite called Moonlighter. Moonlighter is designed specifically to help us all learn space faster through events like Hackasat. Everything is set. The top 8 teams are ready to go. The competition begins now.
Hello, we are back with all the updates from an exciting day of the Hackasat 3 competition. I'm Steve Colenso from the Air Force Research Lab Information Directorate, and I have with me here Captain Eli Williams from Space Systems Command.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think it's safe to say right now things are getting a little spicy out there. A lot has happened. We're here to give you a recap of the scoreboard, show you some of the highlights, and talk more about some of the opening challenges with Jordan. Let's catch you up on what you missed. What you got, Jordan?
That's a great intro. I don't even know if I can follow that, but we'll try to give you. The good news is the game has been so exciting that I think we actually can fulfill the promise of that video intro. So right at the end of the last broadcast, a lot was already happening. We had several different scores. Let's go ahead and go over to the computer. We'll take a look at the scoreboard at that moment. We've even got a really extra fun visualization here for you. So you can see what was happening right there around 12 at the end of our broadcast, 12 Pacific time, of course. We've got several teams that are just all over the scoreboard, right? So we've got, in that particular case, we've got Perfect Blue, who had kind of been quiet. In fact, they were even a little slow getting access to the very first challenge, the very first sort of Hello World challenge in the game. Is just log into your system and make sure you had access to the intended stuff you were supposed to access before the competition portion started. They were the slowest one of that, but they shot up there, and we can see them kind of rising quickly as they got that access. We also had, let's see, make sure we've got it. The main thing that they were able to do there was, sorry, let me back up. There's so many things have been happening here. It's a lot to keep track of. The other one that we had was Veltalis. So Veltalis in the light blue. There's the big jump right there. This was them getting what we call first blood, or it's the first solve on a particular challenge. And in this case, this was Sacred Ground. So if you remember earlier, we talked about Coffee Ground. We knew that, but this was Sacred Ground. So let's see a little bit more about Veltalis and their solves. So with that, Veltalis was able to unlock the other half of the ground stations that we had talked about earlier. We'll give more details about the exact configuration of the ground stations and why they matter so much a little bit later in this broadcast. But it is important to note that now all 10 of the sort of up for grabs ground stations had been accessed by at least one. And then a little bit after that, that was where we actually had Perfect Blue able to jump way up and get access to all of those ground stations. So they were the first to achieve breadth over all of them. And at that point, there was so many lead changes that every team had led by at least once, except for Samurai. So they were in second once earlier, but they were, kind of trailing down here a little bit in the bottom of the scoreboard as these other teams are just back and forth so much on that.
Jordan, with that, is there still hope for those teams at the bottom? I know it's been neck and neck, lead changes all over the place, but for those that are, maybe struggling, is there still a chance there for them? What kind of options do they have?
Yep. So especially with what's been happening in the last few hours, the game has gotten, you said spicy earlier. That's a great explanation. So if I kind of skip forward here to the end, there's been a lot of interesting things happening behind the scenes. They're not all yet showing up on the scoreboard. And so what we're seeing are teams really start to take advantage of the infrastructure that we gave them in the ways that we expected. And it's possible. I guess the short explanation I would say is it is possible, but unlikely probably for one like a Samurai, but for everybody else, very much still in striking range. And even with Samurai, with the right solution, there are still some challenges that are not yet available yet, and that with the right payload, it's possible, although I certainly, if I was a betting person, wouldn't put my money on it, but could happen. Let me go back and, as I mentioned, Perfect Blue was one of those teams that had a brief spot in the first place situation. Let's go ahead and show their quick team summary in remembrance of their first place finish there with all those ground stations. One of the other interesting things that we saw, and to be clear, some of these updates we're giving, we have to be a little circumspect, right? So we are trying to describe what's happened in the game. A lot of the stuff you can see in the scoreboard, and so we can talk about it. Some of it the teams notice, and it's being officially announced. Others of it, we can't go into the details yet, but on that last broadcast, we'll be able to give you a little bit more information. But there is a really important component of this game called the PID, a PID. And this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to channel what I've learned from the experts. But a PID is a proportional integral derivative. It's basically a control loop. It's often used in a lot of systems where you have maybe like a motor or any kind of system with inertia and dampening, and it kind of goes back and forth, so it maybe shocks on a car, or if you've got a self-balancing hoverboard. These systems have this PID, and it's got a number of parameters in it that control, given some input and given a position or given a state, how does it respond? And so this is really relevant for us because the satellites are actually using this information to control how they move, right? And so if you have your PID setting set in a certain way, you'll turn very quickly, but you'll overshoot and then kind of back and correct, and you'll oscillate until you kind of hone in on it. Otherwise, you might have a nice smooth curve, and you might be able to do it more gently. And the way that these things happen will not only impact things like your battery and your angular, one of those other SLA checks that we've talked about earlier is your angular velocity, if you're too sort of out of spec and how quickly you're doing it. And so that can throw off all of these stats that are important parts of your SLA. And as a reminder, if your SLA gets too low in any of these areas, you can trigger space tug or go into safe mode.
So Jordan, can you tell me, we've heard space tug last year in Hackasat 2, you just said it now, and then there's a safe mode condition. Can you explain a little bit more about both of those?
Yes. So Space Tug is not the latest TikTok dance, at least as far as I know. Maybe we'll start it. But the Space Tug, it was just the terminology to, if you think of it like you got a flat tire and you need a tow, or space tow, or space tug, tugboat if a boat's adrift. So in space, the idea is that we wanted a way for teams to recover, especially with some what we're going to be talking about later on, where there's just been a little bit more disruption in what's happening on these systems. They needed an ability, just purely from a gameplay perspective. Now, in the real world, you really just design your systems to be as resilient as possible, to have resets and fail-safes. Real satellites will have fallback mechanisms where they'll automatically reset if an update fails or if they're unable to communicate, and they have a variety of mechanisms. For us, in the game, we essentially built in reset switches, and so the organizers, the competition team, can come in and say, this thing needs to be reset. And there's a variety of automatic criteria which they'll do it just because you were not able to maintain those certain SLA properties that were important, such as battery and whatnot. But there's also, it can also be requested by a team as well. So safe mode is essentially your satellite going into like this kind of recovery mode. And again, that models, your computer can go into a safe mode, right? If you've got a corrupted file, Windows will boot into safe mode. And the idea is that's sort of like a low system state where not all your services are running, but you have minimum ability just to recover.
So it costs you a little bit, but in the real world, you could potentially just totally lose the satellite and money and the mission and everything
if you didn't have any kind of backup mechanism.
Sure, right.
And here, so it's going to cost you in terms of being, you're going to lose availability for a little while. Your score is kind of going to go flat. And other teams, hopefully, if they're keeping the satellite up, are going to continue to climb and grow. It's really important to note, too, all these, if we actually look back at the scoreboard, let's again distinguish between the two types of scoring events that can happen, or several types of scoring events that can happen. When we see the teams with kind of this angled line, that's the team slowly gaining SLA over time, right? Like these angled lines, there's them just continuing to do well with SLA, and the slope of the line relative to their peers is how good is their SLA, how often are they succeeding, how many of those SLA checks are they able to pass. When you see like a big vertical bump, that's like a breakthrough, like a single flag solve where you've got some new challenge, you've got access to something new, and you've got one big bucket of points. Most of those big bucket of points, though, can come at any time, right? And so just because you're the first person to get it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win, because if someone else is later able to get it, they're going to get that kind of same bump. And so then the question becomes, with that big bump, with that access, what did you do with it? Were you able to leverage it and turn it into something that you could access or not? So what we saw with this PID was we saw one of the teams changing their parameters, maybe not particularly efficiently, and so we've kind of been keeping an eye out. We were looking and really hoping some of the teams would figure out how to optimize these values, which would then get them potentially ability to respond and still point and do their normal things they're going to be able to do for other challenges, but keep their SLA as high as possible, which might have been a competitive edge. Haven't seen it yet, so it's a little bit of a hint that the organizers said you should maybe nudge them. So we're also letting them know that in their chat as well. So let's also talk about some of the other challenges, because earlier on we talked about a web server challenge, or 403 Forbidden was the official name of it. It was a custom web server, and we're going to go ahead and we talked about the intro earlier. This is the full solve video that explains a little bit more detail. Still doesn't have the exact specifics for all the teams.
Its goal, the innermost secrets of the cosmos, the key to the very creation of that universe.
Challenge. A website on the game network reveals the existence of a science payload on board the team's satellites. The payload sensor can collect data for missions broadcast by special science ground stations. The website gives a lot of details about how the missions work, but the information needed to receive transmissions from these ground stations is not accessible on the public website content. There appears to be more information available on pages requiring authentication. Teams will need to find a way to access this critical information before completing these missions and obtaining valuable points. Solution. Although important information needed to perform the science missions is in a protected part of the website, bugs in the web server allow teams to exploit it and get access to a lot of data. Not only do they find details for the science ground stations, but an entire catalog of other ground stations, satellites, and their default RF communication settings. In one of the newly accessible folders, there is also a reference to an FTP site that might prove interesting.
Well, most of these score updates that we've seen over the event were the result of teams sort of following in the footsteps of earlier solves. Just about an hour and a half ago, we had a new one, which was Poland Can solving the challenge 150 file status. We've called it internally the FTP server, and I think it's obvious to all the teams that's what it is. Again, only one team has solved that so far that I know of, and so we're going to go ahead and just show you this introduction to it to give you a little bit of context about what the teams are looking at. All right, so I think we're pulling that one up. We're gonna get that that video. In the meantime, the short explanation is that I mentioned there was a web server and an FTP server. These are custom written just for this this event. They're not ones that you could download and you normally have access to. They included some specific vulnerabilities and flaws that the teams are trying to figure out how to access. They were kind of linked together, so information you would find in one would lead you into the next, and it looks like we've got that one pulled up. So let's go ahead and see the intro for FTP.
Through space sensing, such inaccessible regions could be monitored. Many details can be made out by experts from this space photograph.
Challenge. By exploiting the Hackasat 3 game web server, teams became aware of an FTP site that might contain important files. Although the FTP server might have been previously found using a network scanning tool, the information from the web server provides credentials for an account on the FTP site. Unfortunately, the only thing available from that account is the binary of the FTP server itself. Teams need to reverse engineer this binary to see if they can gain additional access to this server and perhaps find more useful information.
So that takes us, if you've been following along the scoreboard, to where we're at now with Poland Can in the lead after a lot of battling back and forth. Again, lots of other teams. 7 of them have been in that first place position throughout the day so far. But let's go ahead and get up there. We're going to talk about some of the latest stuff. We're going to talk in a lot more detail about the ground stations with Mike Walker, one of the competition members. Thank you for coming in. I know you guys have been busy, but tell me about the ground stations, because we've talked a lot about how teams were getting access. We kind of described vaguely that there were like 2 groups of them. Where are these ground stations? What do they start out with, and what have they gotten access to since?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of ground stations in the game that teams can use to make contact with their satellites. And the first thing to talk about with the ground stations is each team has 2 ground stations that are dedicated to them. No one else can use that ground station, and they're located near the North and the South Pole. One is at McMurdo Station in Antarctica, and the other is at Svalbard, closer to the North Pole. And those are real, ground station sites that science missions use all the time, and they're really useful for polar satellites. So
Svalbard has that seed repository
in
it, right?
Exactly. There's also a ground station
Okay.
thing there. For us space people, that's what we think about, not the seed bank.
Not the seed bank, but
of course, yeah. So they have access to those all the time. Nobody can take those away from them. So twice in orbit, they get access to those.
And then what's the total orbit time of each of these?
Each orbit in this game is about 112 minutes long. So, every, I guess, what is it, about 65 minutes or so, they can see a ground station for, anywhere from 5 to about 20 minutes of contact time. But then the more exciting part is there's a group of ground stations that are, not at the poles. They're spread around the globe. And those are competitive. Teams have to solve a challenge to gain access to them, and then they only get access to them for a short window of time to use it. So they can gain access to them, they can use them in between their other accesses to gain access to their satellite.
Perfect. And when they've got access, what are the kinds of things that they might want to do from there?
So they definitely would want to manage their satellite. They might want to make sure they're controlling, make sure the battery is good, make sure they're downlinking bytes, anything they're trying to do. If there's any challenges on the satellite they're trying to solve, they might do that. So there's the satellite ops, and there's the challenge solving that they might want to do on their own satellite.
I guess it's a little bit like, if your cell phone's losing signal a lot, it's hard to kind of get your work done, or if you're at work and your network keeps going down your laptop, because these are essentially their network connections, right? These are when they're able to talk to the satellite.
Yeah, absolutely. You can tell, that when they have a good plan, because they'll do all the things they need to do.
And then, get it done while the window's open.
And then be done.
Yeah.
You can really tell.
That makes sense. And that has been good. I'd say, we showed earlier briefly, like them sort of like looking and aiming and pointing. But now I imagine that's happening for most of the teams most of the time as they're trying to take advantage of the windows that they have. Are we seeing that? Or?
Yeah, it was really cool watching as the teams sort of figure it out. Wow, these antenna beams are a lot narrower maybe than we thought they would be, and we need to point, and then they got them on a line. You could sort of see at one point, everybody sort of started lining up, one after another as they solved it. It was cool.
So let's talk a little bit actually about the lining up too, because I noticed earlier when I showed on stream as they kind of come over the horizon, there's like this, we call them the train, I think was the term used for them, as they come over. How are they ordered in that train? What determined that order? How did that work out?
So they're just sort of in orbital mechanics terms, they're in order of true anomaly. They all have the same orbit with different true anomaly. So they sort of just appear in a line. And we determined that order randomly where the teams all contributed a number that we summed together to get the random seed. So it was truly random, mostly determined by the teams, and we made that the code we use for that public.
And the teams when they're kind of coming by in these orbits, do we look and point and then follow them the whole way around as much as possible? And I think you said earlier that window can change. What's the sort of maximum for any one of these stations that they have access to, and what's like the minimum? Like, how does it change over time?
Yeah, so throughout the course of the game, it will change just based on the real physics, the real orbital mechanics. And at the start of the game, it was closer to maybe 15 to 20 minutes long, and I think at some point in the game it'll really shorten up, and then it should start to grow again.
I think that's one of my favorite things about it is that it like sort of started maybe not in easy mode, but like easier because they had more contact windows, and then as it makes them rely more on those other windows. It makes them be more smarter about taking advantage of the ones that they have. So I think that was really good design.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So how much, like this, one of the things that I think surprised me was, from a CTF perspective, I'm not the space guy, but from a CTF perspective, you have to control how much information you give teams. And if you give too much information, you're sort of like helping everybody know what's going on. It's like, well, we're telling everyone where everything's at and where's all this stuff is going, and it seems like that's a lot of extra information. But I've kind of learned that that's the norm in the space world, right? Like that's actually, like right now you can go and find out about all the stuff that's out in space.
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. There's even a really cool website where you can go see like every object that NORAD tracks in space. It's just like it looks like a huge, ball of fuzz surrounding the planet. You can go see the information about almost every satellite that's out there.
That was something that was fun for me. We'll try to make sure we tweet that out and send people the link for that. I'm signing up our media people for that to get done. I'm sure I'm making their day. But one of the other things I know that's been really interesting the last few hours, this is the fun stuff, right?
Yes.
Is that we had at least a team ask about like, hey, can I use a ground station that I've gotten access to like talk to a different satellite? Do I have to talk to my own, right?
Yeah. We got to the point where a team sort of said, hey, is this allowed? Am I allowed to use my satellite that way? We said, of course it is. It is allowed.
This is an attack defense competition.
It's an attack defense competition, and if you can use your ground station in that way, that's within the scope of the game.
Yeah, there was a phrase that was used a little bit earlier too. I like about opening Pandora's box.
Yes.
Where once this started happening, we're seeing a lot. That's the spicy part of the event right now, right? So we're looking forward to talking more about the details of this once we're not trying to protect the competition of the game at the end. But certainly the teams know it. We've publicly clarified the rules that it is intended that you can in fact impact your competitors, and we're seeing people work through it. I just thought, if I'm a CTF player and I've got some sort of like really cool attack that I can do on my competitors, I better be really thinking through the consequences of that attack, right? And
absolutely. You should really understand, if you let people know that attack is possible, that they could come and do it to you, and you should really think through maybe the defense before you go and throw it off, right?
Yeah. So I wonder how many teams maybe had this idea but held off the attack until they had a good defense kind of lined up or at least close. Mm-hmm. So I think I heard a quote somebody that some teams are playing hack a ground station and some teams are playing hack a sat. Which I thought was good. Thanks you so much, Mike, for coming out. We'll let you get back to the game and let us know if there's any more updates.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jordan.
Awesome. So there you have it, Steve and Eli. Teams are just going crazy. I mean, it's been not only tons of great solving. We've seen multiple challenges solved. We're seeing a lot of lead changes. We're seeing them really lean into it. I feel vindicated. I predicted earlier that we would see a lot more interaction, and I thought maybe tomorrow we're already seeing a lot more of this stuff now. So this is fantastic. There's still a lot left to go, though. We've got our break overnight, of course.
Thanks, Jordan. So, we've heard earlier today in our kickoff show that we didn't just do a digital twin of the flat sat here, but we sort of had to identify the model of the world. We just talked about the ground stations.
Yep.
Those are digital.
Yep.
So the complexity, and then you talked about the information that you have to provide the teams, because if you were to launch your own satellite, you too would have that information, and you need it in order to operate it. Otherwise, you're going in blind. So there's a lot of different complexity with this. So I would imagine that the exploits, whatever, the vulnerabilities, the attack defense nature, the overall game theory itself too has grown in complexity since Hackasat 1 and 2.
It is, I think if we were to lay out just the exploits that teams are having to solve throughout this event, and we were to put them in like a traditional qual-style board where there's just a couple of binaries you download and you submit you attack your server and you get your flag and you're done. This would feel like a very simple CTF, right? It wouldn't be as advanced as some of the other top-tier events. What makes this really interesting, really complicated, and even hard for the teams to kind of grapple with is the dynamics of it. If it's all related, how getting from one gets you to another, how you can leverage the access you previously got, what it gets you, what it doesn't get you, and how, that level of complexity both means that it's a new challenge for the teams as they're trying to kind of figure this out. It also means it's, of course, a challenge for the organizers as they're trying to design this in a way that encourages some of this, but without a way that makes it pure chaos and purely broken, and no one can ever do anything kind of productive. And cross your fingers. So far,
Right,
from my perspective, it's been great. It's been really exciting watching teams. We'll see what the teams think, of course, tomorrow when it's done, and we'll see how it all shakes out.
Yeah, and that makes sense. It really does with the complexity of the game design means the complexity of the actual game competition. So I hope that everyone can appreciate that, especially long-term CTFers and even space experts that might not have ever played in a CTF. And that's really what we're trying to do, is bridge that cyber and space, those subject matter experts, and give them a fun way to do it.
Yeah. One of the other things that it reminded me of is that we talked about the game time being 23 hours and 3 minutes. And we didn't really talk about the exact specifics of why we did that, but that kind of comes into the modeling this complicated system, trying to balance the game and the fairness and the technical and the learning, all these kind of pieces of it. Those 3 minutes are just to make sure everyone has sort of equal access to one last pass over their guaranteed ground stations, right? And so it kind of just worked out that was the guys looking at it and did all sorts of analysis modeling and well, we need to actually give 3 more minutes, and we're like, oh, perfect, that's great. We're happy to do that. And so it's the amount of stuff that they're tracking to do is fantastic.
Right, absolutely. And kind of rewinding there, you mentioned it's obviously not a traditional CTF. I remember last year some of the teams had to kind of roll through some of those challenges in order, kind of as a requirement. Is that different this year? Can teams kind of hop around and solve challenges as they see fit, or maybe to get the tactical advantage over other teams, or how is that going for this year?
There are definitely multiple paths. I would say this is not as totally wide open as maybe a DEF CON CTF, where it's just there's 8 independent services and you can pick anyone that happens to be running. You can attack all at the same time. There are more relationships, and there's more, we mentioned earlier, you use the information from the 403 Forbidden service to find out where that 150, I always forget the numbers, where the 150 file status challenge information was. And so you're using information from one to find another. Right. You use one exploit to then open up something else new. So some of that is sort of sequential, but not nearly to the extent that year 1 was. Year 1 was strictly sequential. Year 2 had more paths kind of through it, and had a couple of kind of branching paths. But I would say this one to me feels even more open than that, where there is a lot of simultaneous things going on. There's several of these things that they can do. You're not going to get stuck on something. Right,
absolutely. And I think we're kind of at that point in the game where the teams are definitely getting way more comfortable with the environment and starting to realize really what they have to do to get to the top. Where are the teams at now, maybe? Are they focused on a specific challenge, or where do you think they are?
So there are not all challenges have been released, unless that happened while we were on camera. But I expect that we'll probably see some more of that tomorrow. And so there is still some surprises left, and I don't believe anyone has solved everything that's out there. There are still some things that are still being worked on by at least every team. So some of them have fewer because they've already kind of made this progress. But there's always, the best part about this is there's always that interaction, the game theory, the defending yourself against the others, the disrupting other teams, as well as just trying to keep your SLA as high as possible, because again, those are points you can't get back. If you have if you can get other people to have a bad SLA and you have a good one, for whatever mechanism, whether you're lowering them or raising yours, that over time is really going to be what determines the winner. Because I would expect that these are all great teams. They're all going to solve most of the challenges, if not all of them, by the end. But the question is, are you able to leverage those other challenges to get those other points that are essentially lost if you don't get them over time?
Yeah, and honestly, that's indicative of the real world. Because you want your satellite functioning because you put it up there for a purpose. That's essentially the SLA. And that's why we put such an emphasis on that portion of the game. So it really brings that real world to the Learn Space Faster slogan that we have this year. Thank you for all that analysis, Jordan. Much appreciated. So as a reminder, please ask any questions on Twitter using the hashtags HAS3Finals, and we will do our best to get to them. Okay, Jordan, one more question from Twitter, though.
All right.
Can you explain the downlink data category on the hackasat.com dashboard is red? Can you explain why the downlink category is red for so many teams?
All right, so let's take a look at that. Let me see if I can find my right tab over here on my system, and we'll get it on screen as well. So it's a good question, and it's been mostly, it's kind of an evergreen, because most of today it has been. This is, again, as we mentioned, this is one of those SLA components. So this is a component that is us making sure you're normal functioning, all systems nominal. We want to know that you've been able to keep your satellite kind of up and going. You'll see these kind of go up and down for various reasons, but generally we've seen way less on the downlink data. Downlink data is intended to be one you don't always have green. You can't always have green because you don't always have communication with your satellite. Essentially, it's saying, are you downloading data from your satellite to a ground
so
station?
when it's not near, right, so if it's
If
not
it's
within
over
range,
one,
it's not making a pass over
exactly,
ground station. You can't have a downlink.
That's right, but it's
Understood.
also why having access to multiple ground stations, those additional ground stations, can help you get higher points in that category because you're able to keep this particular one up potentially longer. There is, of course, also the complication now the teams are especially really trying to figure out this sort of like attack defense and be concerned with those communications back and forth and make sure they don't get taken advantage of. You might find some teams kind of turtling up and trying to minimize their communications, which maybe means they're sacrificing some of SLA in this because they're protecting themselves in other categories. And so there's a lot of interesting questions, and even kind of behind the scenes talking to a lot of the organizers. There's no perfect play. There is no exact answer. It depends very much on what you're doing, your opponents are doing at any given moment. And yeah, in hindsight, you'd be able to go back and say, oh, if so-and-so did such and such, that would be perfect. But this is we don't have perfect knowledge. The teams don't know who's going to attack them when. And so if they did, they could just only turn on the radio when they weren't being attacked and download a bunch of stuff
so
and
again,
get SLA.
real
right?
world.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Is you don't know what your opponents are actually
Exactly.
up to. It's not just this fixed static check that happens in a particular way. You've got to react to the attacks as they're coming.
Yeah, which makes things obviously interesting, difficult, and I think is really why the leaderboard looks the way it does.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen so much of that back and forth exactly because. And this is really only the first 11 hours of the competition so far. We still have 11 more to go tomorrow. It's we've got a couple more tonight and then also some tomorrow. And
Yep,
so
right.
a lot left.
And Jordan, make sure you don't forget about those 3 minutes there.
And
at
the
the
3
end.
minutes, yes.
You got to make sure we
Yeah.
get that in. All right, thanks, Jordan. You did an excellent job bringing us up to speed on where things stand. It's been absolutely fun watching these teams go battle for battle here. This competition's unfolding nicely. As Jordan mentioned, we're only 11 hours in, and we're seeing a ton of activity and creativeness from these competitors from around the world. Let's take a little look at what we have for tomorrow. What do we have, Steve?
So we have a lot to look forward to. Like Jordan said, there's many more hours left. But now we're going to wrap up day one of the competition. We still have a couple hours left, but from here we're gonna end on a high note. We'll be here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific for the start of our day 2 update show. And definitely do not miss our award ceremony where we're going to announce the winners for second and third and have our special guest, founder of DEF CON, Jeff Moss. That'll be at 4 p.m. It's all right here on hackasat.com. But in the meantime, please again follow us on Twitter for live scoreboard viewing and updates. With that, good night from Hackasat headquarters, or depending where you are, good morning. We'll see you either today or tomorrow.